Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martin Lehmann, and I'll be the moderator for the PhD defense today. My tasks, fortunately, are very simple. I bid you welcome. I introduce you and frame the defense. I keep track of time during the sessions, and then I invite you to the reception afterwards. And it's all very enjoyable. And I hope, of course, we'll have an enjoyable afternoon. So basically, let's get going. On behalf of the Faculty of Engineering and Science here at Aalborg University and the Department of Development Planning, I'd like to welcome you all to Anja Wejs' PhD defense of her thesis titled Climate Change, or Climate for Change, Integrating Climate Change into Cities Planning Practices. And this is the thesis, dissertation. You can see also the place here and here. During her PhD studies, Anja has been supervised by Professor Lone Körner, sitting here, and Associate Professor Matthew Cashmore, hiding somewhere there, and both here from the Department of Development Planning. For the defense, the faculty has appointed an assessment committee consisting of 3 members. 2 of these are external to the university, so a special welcome to Sirkku Juhola from University of Helsinki in Finland, and Hans Runha from Utrecht University in the Netherlands, sitting here in the front. As chairman of the committee, the faculty appointed Arne Remmen, also from the Department of Development Planning, and sitting here in front. On behalf of the faculty then, I'd like to, first of all, of course, acknowledge the work carried out so far by the committee, and look forward also to the work today, as we all do, I guess. Our program is divided into 2 main sessions with a short break in between, a 15-minute break. First, Anja will give her PhD lecture for a maximum 45 minutes. And Anja, I will let you know when you have about 10 minutes left, and then again when you have about 5 minutes left, so we can wrap things up and not overshoot and overrun, and there will be all matters of things to take care of. And second, the committee will comment and raise questions to Anja and discuss the thesis and the work behind it. And that session will then last a maximum of 1 hour, 55 minutes. All in all, the whole show should take no more than 3 hours, and we will be done by 4 p.m. today. During the second part, questions from the audience, from you, are also allowed. Should you have any questions, you need to approach me first during the break. And then I'll slot you in when we have time for that. And I will then factor in on the committee's time allotted. Unannounced questions will not be allowed during the defense. So, at 4 p.m. we'll end. And then I'll announce that we go to a reception hosted by the department. The reception will be at the Prominente, across from here, at Vesterhavn Promenade 5. So without further ado, anyways, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin. First of all, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And thank you for the committee for reading my thesis. And thank you, Hans and Sirkku, for coming here today. Before I begin the presentation, I'll just say a few words in Danish. Tusind tak, fordi I er her alle sammen. Det er sådan virkelig overvældende at se så mange komme. Det er lidt mere end 3 års arbejde, som jeg afslutter i dag. Og det er lidt en milepæl. Så tusind tak, Stine. So, I'll start the presentation, and I named my thesis Climate for Change, and integrating climate change into cities planning practices. And cities in the thesis is Danish municipalities, and the context is mainly within Denmark. So the agenda for today is an introduction where I explain why my thesis, why my work has been relevant, or is relevant. I'll briefly go through the research question and the methods behind the thesis, and I will go more in depth with the theory development of the theoretical conceptual framework that I've made through the thesis, and my results and analysis, and then briefly about the conclusions and the directions for future research. So why climate for change? Climate can be understood as social environment, but it's also a physical phenomenon. And I deal with both in my thesis, both about the social environment around the integration of climate change into cities planning practices. But it's also around climate change as a physical phenomenon. And climate change is today recognized as unavoidable, which is stated in the IPCC 4th assessment report. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal, as is now evident from observations of increases in global average air and ocean temperatures, widespread melting of snow and ice, and rising global average sea level. Within this includes both climate change mitigation and adaptation, and mitigation is to prevent climate change by reducing greenhouse gases, mainly carbon emissions. And it's also to adapt and prepare for the experience of expected climate impacts. And we see that in Denmark mainly by flooding, and mainly by intense precipitation and cloudbursts. And these pictures are, maybe Lone, if you'll kill the light. Pictures are from 3 places in Denmark and 3 different incidents. One is from Aalborg, it's actually just down the street. Underneath the railway, and where you can see that the flooding caused it's inconvenient for driving around. And in Copenhagen, which is now called the 2nd July flood because it was so sincere, it was impossible to drive up the main highway towards Lyngby. And this situation also caused flooding of the main hospital in Copenhagen, and it was only a few centimeters for causing power shutdown of the whole hospital. So it's not only inconvenient, it's also very costly, not at least for infrastructure and for businesses. This also means that climate change is a cross-sectoral planning issue because it includes various different measures and sectors like transportation, energy, buildings, nature, and adaptation. And just to mention one example, nature, building new forest, afforestation, and establish wetlands will both keep rainfall where it's falling on the ground, so you retain it from flooding, for example, a nearby city, but it will also store and capture carbon emissions. So it's a measure that includes both mitigation and adaptation. Is also where you can see there's some synergy between climate change mitigation, adaptation, and other environmental objectives. But all these measures, they are to be integrated into the existing plans and processes of a municipality, and they are also to be integrated into the municipal organization. And this figure is very big, and you're not supposed to be able to read it, but it's an organizational chart of a Danish municipality. And on the top here, you will see the city council, and then you will see the directors for each sector and overall department. And there's 6 departments in this specific case. And within one of these overall departments, there are several sub-departments. And within each sub-department, there are sub-units. And climate change, in this case, is placed in the nature environment. sub-department. And this sub-department includes 300 people, employees, and climate change is then situated in a sub-unit within this. So to be able to integrate all these different sectors, this is the Nature Environment Department. To integrate transportation, you have to go up the hierarchy and across the hierarchy, and also across to all the other departments. It's not to be said that this is indeed difficult. Climate change is also to be integrated into the Danish planning hierarchy, and this is the municipal planning hierarchy. And we have spatial plans that are comprehensive plans, and they are legal required plans, they're mandatory, and so are the sector plans. And then there's thematic plans that are voluntary and that municipalities can choose to make because they want to brand something or because it's just an easy way to divide responsibility between who does what. Within spatial planning, we have a plan strategy, and the actual spatial plan, which in Danish is called kommuneplanen, which then set frameworks for the very local zoning plans with a bit more detailed plans. And the sector plans, it could be the sewage system, it could be the water supply system, it could be waste management. And within the thematic plans, we then find the climate change plans because they are voluntary, and there are no rules that say, up till today, that municipalities are to make climate change plans. I focus, of course, on the climate change plans, but I also focus on the spatial plans because they're also comprehensive, and there's a framework for the process of cross-sectoral planning. And I, on top of that, also focus on what is called strategic environmental assessment, which is an EU directive of assessing the significant impact on the environment of certain plans and programs. So the climate change plans, they are voluntary, and the municipal spatial plans, they are mandatory by law. And SEA, Strategic Environmental Assessment, is then the only regulation in spatial planning that include a climate. And as I said, it's an EU directive, and it's mandatory for both mandatory plans and voluntary plans if they will have a significant impact on the environment. And these are all the different factors that are to be included in that assessment, and I just highlighted climatic factors as one of them. And on top of that, it also sets requirements that you have to assess synergistic and cumulative effects, as for example the case with the wetlands and the afforestation. So before I go into the research question, I just want to highlight three key concepts that I use all the time. One is climate change planning, one is integration, you already heard them, and then the third one is climate change governance. And I use climate change planning when it has to do with the characteristics of the actual plans. That is, what kind of goals do they have, what kind of targets do they include emission inventories, the risk assessment, and what kind of actions do they point out. And integration is then either to include these plans in the municipal administration, or to include the different climate change related measures, activities into the existing planning and the processes of these plans. And climate change governance is then the characteristics of how this is done on a longer time frame, and how is that developing over time. I'll come back to that. So to sum up, cross-sectoral coordination is difficult, and that is due to the municipalities that have many plans. They are large, they're political, bureaucratic, and sector-divided organizations, and they are definitely not accustomed to horizontal communication and coordination. And when to integrate climate change across all these sectors, it's very likely to exceed norms and taken for granted practices. And on top of that, climate change plans, they are voluntary, there's no regulatory support for this integration. So you can say that they are in an institutional void where the norms and practices are to be built first. So going into the research questions. So the overall research question for the thesis is, what are the institutional implications for integrating climate change into spatial planning processes at the municipal level in Denmark, and how do the municipalities seek to solve this? So there's two things in this research question. One is the constraints and the issues of this integration process, and the other is looking at how do they try to solve this. And I focus my research in three sub-questions. One that looks more into these constraints and how they try to legitimize their actions for this integration. And I work with the structure and agency concept, that is the municipal administration and the people that works within this administration. And I focus on the planning documents and the processes behind these planning documents, and that is, as I said before, the climate change plans and the spatial plans and the strategic environmental assessment. And I answer the research question through 5 journal articles. I'm not going to read up this chart, it's more to give a status of the papers. So the first paper, I'm proud to say, is now in press and will be published in the second volume of Environment and Planning C next year. It will be published online sooner. The second paper, I'm very proud to say that it did not get rejected by Global Environmental Change by the first review. They reject more than 50% of the papers the first time they see them, but it's under review for second submission. And the second, the last paper, the fifth paper, is also in press and will be published online any day soon. So of course behind all these papers I've done several studies and there's a lot of methods behind them, and I won't go into detail with these methods. I'll just say that I use document studies, interviews and observations, and you can see that my investigations are more or less on 3 different levels, going from a general level to a detailed level. On the general level, I co-authored a paper with Lone Kørnø and Sanne Varmen Larsen, which deals with assessment of 149 environmental reports, and screened 48 climate change plans, which are all the plans published by the municipalities at the time. And on the more meta level, the middle level, did some comparative case studies, one of 8 Danish municipalities and one comparative case studies of 2 Danish and 2 Norwegian municipalities on climate change adaptation. And then I did a detailed single case study of Aarhus municipality. And these 5 studies then make the 5 papers that make the analysis of the thesis. And to interpret all of this data, all these studies, I built on the theory of new institutional theory and developed a conceptual framework on that basis. And I took point of departure in new institutional theory because this tradition tries to explain the differences between the formal structure and the informal structure. And the informal structure tells a bit about what's actually taking place, what we cannot see just by looking at it. And the institutional theory, it highlights the cultural influences, and the keywords for these cultural influences are mentioned by Barley and Tolbert here as values, norms, rules, beliefs, and taken for granted assumptions. And I define institutions in relation to Richard Scott's 3 pillars of institutionalization. And this is also a big chart, but I'll explain, just highlight some of the main things about it. He divides institution in what he calls the regulative pillar, which are rules and regulations, and the normative pillar, which are like the norms and values, and the cultural cognitive, which you can say is the taken for granted and shared understanding. And in relation to climate change planning and climate change integration, the cultural cognitive pillar can be explained as the different subcultures within all these different departments and units and subunits. And the normative pillar you can exemplify with, for example, the Danish Organization for Nature Conservation has this voluntary commitment on climate change plans that the municipality can commit itself to reduce its carbon emissions 2 to 3% per year. There's no sanction if the municipalities do not comply with this commitment. They might be kicked out of the program, but they won't get any fee for it. And then there's the regulative pillar, and you can say that is weak in terms of climate change because there is no law that you have to conduct climate change plans. But then there's other related laws. For example, the SEA that I take as point of departure, but there's also other laws. Danish laws, for example, the Danish Planning Act would be one that can influence. But my theoretical development has not been a linear process, it's been an iterative process where I've developed different concepts over time. And this chart, you can see you have the new institutional theory here, you have the literature, the existing literature in climate change planning, and then you have the empirical observations. And what I saw in the literature and in my own observation was that the role of actors is quite large. Specific types of actors, they play as drivers for the climate change agenda at the local level. And new institutional theory has an emphasis on how institution constrains behavior and less on how institution can be changed. So I had to modify and adapt my theoretical concepts to include the role of actors in new institutional theory. And I draw on emergent stand within this area, and I draw on Scandinavian literature in this area. So the specific types of actors, I don't include all types of actors in my thesis. I focus on what is termed institutional entrepreneurs, which in the Scandinavian languages are called ildsjæle. And it doesn't translate very well to English because it will mean soul of fire. But there's some things about these actors that characterize them, and that is enthusiasm, interest, and will, and that they have some kind of ability to operate independently of all these institutional constraints, and that they can create new opportunities by collecting a certain amount of people, and also leverage resources to implement their actions. So on this basis, I developed this framework, which is my conceptual framework. And just briefly explaining it, Scott's definition of institution I define as the structure. And then we have the actors in the bottom of the figure. And then we have mechanisms, things that influence the climate change planning, things that trigger something to happen, called active causal forces, you can also call them. And all these errors, they are these types of mechanisms, and that is, a mechanism started as a normative one can also over time influence the cultural cognitive pillar. And then I focus very much on legitimacy, that is, how do these actors try to legitimize their actions on climate change? What do they do to make them seem appropriate and desirable? And I'll just show you where the different papers fit into this framework, because I did not test this framework, it is developed through the papers. And the first paper, the one of the comparative study of the 8 Danish municipalities, is very much focused on the normative pillar, but also a bit actor-oriented. It deals a bit also into the cultural cognitive things, but does not deal so much with the regulative pillar. The second paper is much more dealing with the cultural influences on climate change integration, and has a more equal division between actors and institutions. The third pillar, the third paper is the comparative study of the Danish and Norwegian municipalities, and it is slightly more actor-focused and still also a bit more normative focused than the case study of Aarhus, which is the second paper in the thesis. Then I used the SEA to look at the regulative pillar, and this is the paper of the SEA report that also explains some of the lack of climate change integration in SEA reports through normative and cultural cognitive aspects. And the last paper with SEA of climate change plans, the case study of, the study of 48 municipalities, climate change plans, is mainly regulative and only slightly go a bit into the normative pillar. And now I'll tell you a bit about my results, and I will tell you, present my results through answering my research questions. That is, I will not go through each of the 5 papers. It will be a synthesis of the papers, and I will highlight a few aspects from each paper. And of pedagogical reasons, I'll start with sub-question 3. And sub-question 3 deals with the planning documents and the processes behind the planning documents. And what I find, just to draw some things out, is that the climate change plan is the main integration tool. SEA and spatial planning is not used to integrate climate change as the main approach. And the climate change plans are also widely regarded as explorative plans where you can test different things out. And it's situated in sub-departments, mainly in the technical and environment departments. And because they don't take advantage of the existing planning processes, they will have to build up new processes around the climate change plans. And what I also see that SEA is mainly, climate change is mainly ignored in the processes of the SEAs, and it has a weak link to municipal spatial planning. And I will draw on some of the results of the studies behind this. So we see lack of integration in the SEA reports. Of the 149 plans, only half of them include mitigation measures, and even less adaptation, and to include them both is only 12%. So SEA is not used at first as a cross-sectoral integration tool, and it's not used to create regulatory legitimacy for climate change. But that is also due to that the discourse of climate change has changed from in the EIA back in the 80s, we're focused on the microclimate, and the discourse now has changed to be focused on the global issue of climate change. Integration of climate change into the environmental report is, however, increasing, and for 2009, the latest for the SEAs for 2009 in this review was more than 60% of them that included mitigation. And because due to this lack of integration of climate change into SEAs, the EU has now also published the guidance on how to integrate climate change and biodiversity into environmental reports. But SEA is also used on voluntary plans as the climate change plans. And of a study of 48 climate change plans, there was only one that included the screening of its potential significant impact on the environment, and only one was environmental assessed. And looking at reviewing these 48, we found that at least 18 was mandatory to SEA, and 9 needed a screening to decide whether or not its potential, its impact on the environment would be significant. And because there's only 2 of these 48 plans that has a screening and an SEA, it questions the legitimacy of the plans, and if the plans has not been environmental assessed, and they should have, then they cannot be used as a basis for future administration, meaning that the plan cannot be the plan that sets out the specific projects or actions in the real life, so to speak. So that means that these specific action would then have to be implemented through other types of plans, for example, a transportation plan or the spatial plan or an energy or heat production plan. And this is due to, first of all, the role of the actors' discretion, that is how they interpreted whether or not a specific measure will have a significant impact on the environment. And it also is due to that the Danish Parliament implemented the EU directive wrongly in 2004, stating that voluntary plans did not have to be screened for significant impact. And that change was made in 2009 to make up for that mistake. What we also see is there's a lack of synergies and trade-offs, and this might correlate to that SEA and climate change and spatial planning are taking place in different places within the planning processes and within the organization. And this is a non-compliance with the SEA's requirement, but it also means that there will be a risk of sub-optimization and a risk of tunnel vision. For example, with the energy, the climate change plan only focuses on mitigation and energy. There could be an issue if there's a large focus on producing energy crops. And for energy crops, then you'll take out a piece of farmland. And for that production that's been on the farmland before, you'll then have to import whatever's been produced on that specific land before. And that environmental impact might be larger than the benefit of having energy crops produced on that specific land. So slightly more synergies in the climate change plans, but they are mainly related to other environmental objectives such as health and public transportation and bicycling. And sorry, trade-offs, they are negative synergies. So looking behind what is causing all this lack of integration, I'm looking at the structure and agency and the linkage between the two concepts in the integration process. And just to look at the formal structure first and the constraining side of that, I picked a quote from Aarhus Municipality, from the urban planner there, stating that when climate change becomes a part of this catalogue, then of course it shall be integrated into the municipal spatial plan, but if you politically and administratively want to remain at a level where you can act a bit more freely until the integration into the plan is a demand, it might be a good idea to keep it out of the plan to be able to act a little faster, instead of going through an almost 4-year process to amend the municipal spatial plan. And this catalogue is a catalogue stating what has to be, what must be included in the municipal spatial plan. And what he also states here is that they are reactive instead of proactive in terms of integrating climate change into the municipal spatial plan. But he also states that because the reason that they are so reactive is that it's a very rigid platform to integrate climate change into. If you integrate a specific type of measure into the spatial plan, it might be costly if you have to change the plan again. It's not only a long process, but you might also have to pay compensation for the people that own the specific land where you change the requirements for what you can do on this specific land. To look into the more informal, it shows a quote to exemplify this from Sønderborg Municipality, and it's one of the project managers of climate change, stating that it is a bit of a supertanker that has to be rotated. Hence we have some departments with some traditions and ways of thinking, and then we come in from the side and tell them to think differently. It is not easy to get a municipality to change behavior. And this also has to do with that if you have a climate change plan that includes a lot of measures across transportation and nature and water and the citizens' behavior, you want to put a lot of different actions into this plan, but if you're sitting in a sub-department in nature and environment, you don't have the responsibility or the authority to be the one implementing these. So you are dependent on working together with other peoples in other departments. And that if you don't speak the same language, if you have different professions, different backgrounds, that can be very difficult. So to look a bit deeper into this process, I looked at the concepts of mechanisms and legitimacy to then understand then how do they then try to integrate and to legitimize these actions. And I'll start exemplifying that with a quote where legitimacy has been exceeded. And this is also from the case of Aarhus, where an urban planner and manager says that you can look at them, the climate secretariat, from the outside and think, why did you not know from the beginning that you should talk to these people in a certain way? But it is simply a culture you have to build, even in regards to municipal planning. It would not be possible to create such a process today, even if there were a law. You would not be able to create a culture with each other within 5 minutes. And what the urban planner here says is that there's been some incidents where the climate secretariat has stepped over some toes and spoken in a way that was not perceived appropriate. But she also reflects on the process, and she also reflects to the process around the spatial plan, where they have had a very good collaboration with planners from other departments, also the transportation department, the building departments, budget and accounts, very cross-sectoral on the municipality. And she states that even that the municipal spatial plan is mandatory and demanded by law, it's not due to that they had a good process, it's because they developed a culture around how they do cross-sectoral planning. And that takes time, she says. But for some municipalities, this internal integration process is too difficult, and they then try to bypass some of these constraints by establishing local networks and creating partnerships and financial funds together with some of the local businesses. And they exploit the narrative of green growth, and especially in Denmark, is the narrative and the discourse around the wind energy. And the whole Danish wind adventure, as it's called. And now it's also stated that water is the new wind, so the water technologies are the new way forward. This also means that climate change planning is becoming a project-based approach, where they build projects with the businesses, and it's a demand made by the businesses, instead of being a spatial planning approach. And there's a risk when these two processes are not linked, the climate change, instead of being integrated across these sectors, then develops into its own field. And this is new in terms of for the literature, because in the literature there's a large focus on the role of the international and national networks. For example, ICLAI and Covenant of Mayors that played a large role in the literature explaining on climate change as a multi-level governance field. But this is less important seen in this way. There's also less weight on the norms of the rights of the future generation that comes from the sustainability agenda and local agenda 21, where here the municipalities draw on growth and green growth, and the way forward is development. And what I see is that some of these actors, the institutional entrepreneurs, they of course play a large role in driving this agenda forward, but where they, in the literature, sometimes I mention that as long as there's an institutional entrepreneur, that's the solution for climate change at the local level, because then they will drive the agenda forward. I question this and say that, well, they're still somehow bound by the structure and the context that they're in, and they will have to provide legitimacy in terms of resources, choosing the right narratives to use and to collect consensus among a large amount of people and create a shared understanding. And it's necessary for the success of climate change that this process also involves organizational learning, and that the integration is also into the existing practices. Otherwise, when these individuals, they then will leave the organization, it might also cause that the climate change agenda will die out. From this, I see that climate change governance is not just one approach, it's several approaches so far. And I will not go so much into detail with this chart, but just say that I see at least 3 types of climate change governance, depending on if it's characterized by the process is with ambiguity, and that they have to bargain and they have to negotiate between the different subcultures and different partners to be able to integrate climate change, or whether that they kind of an experimental, that they choose on a trial and error basis different projects and try different stuff out, but which is not necessarily a widespread approach within the municipality. Or if climate change is more or less like standardized, you can say it's more or less institutionalized by integrating it into existing procedures within the municipality. Just to draw out some examples, Copenhagen municipality is an example of a negotiation approach, but they, and together with Herning and Aarhus. But the difference with Copenhagen is that they had very clear responsibility areas, dividing who is doing what at very early stages, which might not be, we don't know yet, but might not be so good for the synergies and trade-offs, but at least they seem to have less problems than Aarhus and Herning in terms of communicating across the municipality. For Aarhus it was too difficult, and they actually turned to be more experimental, being much more project-based, working with the local businesses, which might be good to push things forward, but might not be good in the long run if it's not integrated across the different sectors. Skive and Lolland they are two examples of the experimental approach. Lolland calls itself as a climate laboratory, where they sell themselves as businesses and universities can come and buy test facilities, and then they will do the man hours, but they will allow for different projects to take place. And Kolding and Albertslund are two examples where they included climate change into the sustainability agenda, and included climate change just as another issue within sustainability and local agenda 21. So didn't experience the same problems in the integration process. In the chaos states, I didn't, because I only chose cases that have climate change plans. I didn't focus on cases that where they don't know how to start or how to begin with. Moving into the conclusions. So, is there climate for change? And I will ask that by answering my research question. Focusing on the institutional implications, the constraints and issues on this process and how to solve them. And as I see the institutional implications, they are in large cultural cognitive, the way that climate change exceeds the taken for granted ways of doing things. And they don't use the existing regulative and normative structures around SEA and spatial planning. And institutional entrepreneurs, they use narratives and brief growth to legitimize their actions, and they do that in large by the establishment of partnerships and creating legitimacy by building up a demand from society on the municipality that they have to act on these specific issues that the businesses then want to put they want to implement in practice. So yes, there is a climate for change, a social climate, social environment for change, but it seems very much that it has to be fought for. So what I see that this work contributes with, just to highlight a few, is that institutional entrepreneurs, they are important as drivers for the agenda and for pushing this agenda forward. We are not hyper-muscular in the sense that as long as you have an institutional entrepreneur, you will automatically have success on climate change planning. And the focus on structure and agency in regard to institutional mechanisms and legitimacy has made it possible to explain the differences in the local climate change governance, and there's a potential to carry this forward and understand how social change processes they occur and explain why they take certain directions in society. So what I want to take forward is to test the conceptual framework in an international context. I developed it and tried it in a Danish context, but I would like to take it into cities that are at different continents and within different institutional settings. It could be that they have similar climate change challenges in terms of flooding, but they have different government forms and different governance forms, for example, community or new public management. And then are the challenges then perceived the same? Are they different? And what is it that makes these differences? And can other municipalities, other cities learn from that? Then there's new regulative and strong normative amendments taking place. Adaptation plans are now mandatory from this year. Danish municipalities have to conduct adaptation plans. And this will be some nice follow-up research within that area on how that is perceived and how that is done. So to follow up on this new SEA guidance from the EU on specifically on climate change and biodiversity as cross-sectoral issues. Then there's also an issue I find very interesting is the public-private partnerships, as we see here, between the municipalities and the local businesses, and focus that maybe on adaptation and on the insurance companies and the utility companies and the local governments, how that can form, how that can take place, and how the insurance companies perceive flooding and how they deal with flooding, how there can be data exchange between the local authorities and also the insurance companies and the utility companies. And with those words, I'd like to open up for questions in the defense and hopefully a good and interesting discussion after the coffee break.